You can have a campus that has a great climate where all students feel like they belong. You can have a campus where they have top-notch advising, caring, effective advisors, where the teaching is excellent and pedagogy suits students' learning styles. But if they can't get the course, there's no progress.
That was Terry Brown, the VP of Academic Innovation at AASCU, the Association of State Colleges and Universities. We had a great conversation about student success at scale and how her team is working across institutions on initiatives like redesigning policies and processes, optimizing the course schedule, and more. Working with Terry when she was a provost was as enlightening as it was enjoyable, and so I hope you feel the same way about this episode.
Welcome to the Connected College podcast. I'm your host, Elliot Felix. I've helped more than 100 colleges and universities change what they offer, how they operate, and how they're organized to enable student success. And if you're a leader in higher ed and you think that the silos and separations get in the way of student success, then this podcast and my upcoming book, The Connected College, are for you. We're here to learn and work together to bust silos, question tradition, and forge partnerships so that students feel connected to their college, their community, their coursework, and their careers. I'm really excited to talk to Terry about student success at scale. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Elliot, and I'm excited to talk to you. I remember our first conversation at the Society for College and University Planning, SCUP
Yeah,
conference. I
yeah,
don't
we had
know if
office
you remember.
hours or
We
something. Yeah,
did
we
side by
both we had
side, and
side by side office hours,
I
right?
was so taken with what you were presenting, and that we then had a partnership that
Yeah.
and worked on a great project at SUNY Fredonia together. I learned so much from you and your team.
Thank you so much. And let's keep learning together. I'm excited about the work you're doing at scale and how you're supporting so many different campuses and bringing them together and giving them tools and training. We know each other, but our audience doesn't. Tell me a little bit about how you got started in higher ed.
Mm. I started as an assistant professor of English at the University of Wisconsin River Falls. I felt I came from the University of Florida, where the graduate program there that I graduated from did not think that going to an institution like the University of Wisconsin River Falls was the sign of success for that program, that they wanted me to be someplace else at one of the more elite institutions. And it took some years for me to realize that I was actually exactly where I needed to be, that I loved working with the students that I was working with. They were first in their families to go to college. In the case of the University of Wisconsin River Falls, it was a lot of students coming from dairy farms, and they were hardworking, earnest, not always academically oriented, but eventually really committed to succeeding. And I think I learned a lot about student success as a faculty member working with them in my classes, in my English classes, particularly writing classes. But then I became a dean and a provost, and I was on 3 different campuses, and most recently at SUNY Fredonia. And across the arc of my career, began, I think, probably not as very student centered in my first years as a faculty member, more faculty centered. But over time, really became student centered in my work and passionately devoted to and committed to making sure that we were removing artificial obstacles to student success, because there were so many that we had created inadvertently.
Give us a before and after. What did faculty centered Terry do
Oh,
versus student centered
right.
Terry?
I would say I was focused on, as a faculty member, covering the material and performing as a lecturer in front of my audience, the students, and learned how to become a more empathetic facilitator of learning
Right.
as opposed to teacher as performer, and to cultivate a real relationship with the students in a way that was less hierarchical, honestly. and ego-centered, just talking about my ego. And what I found was I was best as a teacher when I was also challenged by the material. So I really sought texts that were challenging to me as well, so I could sit around the table with them and struggle together with meaning and understanding. And that, you know, this is easy when you're an English professor because there's a lot of poetry, there's a
Yeah.
lot of literature, there's a lot of text. What happens when you're challenged by a great text, particularly one that speaks to what it means to be human, which is what literature does and film does? What happens is that you're changed, your students are changed, and that, to me, that alchemy is really brilliant. That's the before and after. I was a much better teacher after.
More empathy, less hierarchy, more seeking challenge, seeking collaboration. How does that inform what you're doing today, how you lead today?
Because I continue to put students at the center of what we do. Even though I'm in at an association that works with institutions that serve the students, so I'm removed from the work directly, students are still at the center of what we do. The team I work with here in academic innovation and transformation seek to understand who we're serving. Who are the students that our AASCU institutions are serving? The numbers of students, the percent of students who are Pell eligible, the numbers of students who are Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, first generation. How many veterans do we have? How many international students are we teaching? And then you get a picture of the students that we're serving that is not what people think when they think of the university. I think now the public has in mind an idea of college that is very elite
Outdated. Yeah.
and dated.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about serving our members, it's how do we help them help their students succeed in
Yeah.
the way that those institutions define student success.
Yeah. That was going to be my next question, actually. How do you define student success? It sounds like you have a little bit of a federated model.
I'll leave it up to the states and
But
listen to your institutions about
yeah.
how they're defining it. The work that they're doing is to prepare students who are going to be globally engaged citizens who have a credential that will lead to a job that can support them and a family. That's success. That helps them and gives them a dimension in their life that leads to, I think, happiness and fulfillment. I don't think that's too much to ask for,
No.
to have a little extra help with on the happiness side of things. And it shows, studies show that is the case for college educated. So that's what we think about. We think about, are we doing a good job? Are we helping our campuses do a good job and preparing students who are informed and educated?
Yeah. You have to do the work by working together. It's interesting. On the one hand, you have to be locally attuned and how our institutions defining it. On the other hand, you want to create some consistency and share what
Mhm.
works across these different institutions and some common threads about global and career and
Mhm.
happiness and fulfillment.
Mhm.
How do you create that common ground? I'm thinking about National Association of Colleges and Employers. They have their
Mhm.
8 competencies.
Right. Mhm.
Do you have something you use to create that common ground or that shared definition of student success across the campuses?
Created our own for our association,
Yeah.
but we do facilitate those conversations among cohorts of institutions about how they're defining student success. Now, in the case of work that we've done that's funded, for example, by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation,
Mm.
there we're working with a foundation that has a clear set of
Yeah.
metrics.
I'm guessing there might be some data and metrics involved.
And
Yes.
there is data and metrics involved. And
Nice.
A simple set of metrics related to graduation rates and retention rates, et cetera.
Employment is
And
employment
employment,
employment
yes,
rates.
yes. We find no problem with the metrics that
Hmm.
our funder is looking
That's
at.
a good starting point.
It
Yeah.
absolutely is. What I find in an environment where states have backed away from the investment that they once made in public higher education and where funders have stepped in to do work to invest in student success at scale. I I think what we have to be mindful of is that it's higher ed, American higher education that has to really define what our priorities are. When you have major investments being made by large funders, you have to make sure that their priorities are in line with our priorities and values.
Right.
That is the case with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We've been working with them now for years. They've made a major investment. We're working with, at this point, we have 60 institutions in 4 cohorts. We started with a kind of a proof of concept that we worked with a small group of about 6 institutions to refine a process of helping them with institutional transformation, data-focused, data-centered institutional transformation over a couple of years. We refined that process, and now we're scaling it. And now we're working with 60 institutions. And we have the capacity to build these number of institutions that are doing this work. And what they're doing is they're understanding what the data is telling them first. And for many institutions, this is an important first step. It used to be campuses would say, we don't have the data. I don't think that there's any campus out there that can say, we don't have the data.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
Now they've
Yes.
got the
Yeah.
numbers. It's okay. Now, so what? I knew somebody in IR was so good, and she would say, okay, the first question is what? So what are you asking? The second one is so what? And then the third is now
Now
what?
what? Yeah.
And so many institutions are now at so what? And what we do is we've got teams of people who work with these campuses to help them get to so what, and then to identify what needs to change at the campus level.
And as you run that playbook, what are some of the key things you've learned for student success at scale?
We do a policy summit every year where we bring in our institutions and we talk about all those policies out there
Hmm.
and those procedures on hundreds of campuses
Like
that
having to apply for graduation,
are
even though
obstacle
you have your credits.
exactly having to
Yeah.
apply. Oh, you didn't apply. So we have a policy summit and we
Yes.
found it's really very helpful because then you can also do comparisons. You got
Right.
institutions, you've got multiple institutions there that can say, we fixed that problem
Yeah.
with this. And we just eliminated it and there was no impact. We could talk about the holds on that is
Registration holds
yeah,
and yeah,
registration holds and
library fines.
yeah, and then what the drop ad policy is and
Hmm.
just a lot of things that may be in place that no one at any point said, why are we doing this?
Yeah. It's the way we've always done it.
And I actually think that's because whoever is implementing it does not feel like they have the agency to say, this doesn't make sense.
Yep.
That's where change management comes in. Change management is so important because you can't just say, we have lots of policies that need to
Hmm.
be changed, but you really have to have tools, particularly the communication tools, to change the culture, to empower people with the insight to say, here's a change we could make, and it would really help students. And then to have a culture where those people are being heard.
So it sounds like we've got get everybody together and audit and compare your policies and procedures relative to these artificial barriers. And then it sounds like another key tactic is empowering people to identify these things, change these things,
Yes.
giving them some air cover to do that, managing the process.
We have a whole series of workshops for middle managers in student success because of how critical they are. And they are overlooked in this work. And so they're the associate provost of student success or the director of student success, because they've got this role where they're not in the necessarily a position
Yeah.
to make a decision that's institutional, but they're hearing from students, they're hearing from faculty. And so, how do we help them feel empowered and give them the tools in order to communicate up and horizontally
And
and
down.
vertically and down?
That's so smart because often middle management is the segment that's most resistant to change because they're both not making the decision and they're caught in the middle in terms of executing it. And they have sometimes the most to lose and
Mhm.
territory and turf and
Mm.
so forth.
And I think they're overlooked in this
Yeah.
work because what the focus may be on faculty, on advisors,
Hmm.
on the leadership,
Hmm.
presidents, provosts, but they're unsung heroes of the student success work.
Yeah, absolutely. And they need help and support. And I think as guilty as anyone in terms of the way my brain works since I've been in a leadership role is to fall into this trap of once you make the decision, you move on to the next thing. And then in your head, it's done. But the work still has to happen to make that decision, make that direction come to fruition. And the people that are doing that are the ones that need the voice and the support.
Another thing that we're doing is something that I did with my colleague Lisa Hunter at SUNY Fredonia,
Mhm.
and that is to re-engineer the course schedule to be student-centered. So we talked about policies and procedures, and the course schedule is one that's all about policies and procedures. But thinking about the technologies of delivering the degree,
Mhm.
the course schedule is the engine of that work. If the purpose of the institution is to prepare students who have credentials in hand, the course schedule is critical, but it can be overlooked in the student success work.
Yeah, and it can create those artificial barriers that you started off by saying it's our job to remove. I remember working with an institution that identified one of their biggest barriers to student success is too many off-grid classes where departments were just it was like the Wild West and they were scheduling courses whenever and not following the grid so that your course starts half an hour later and goes half an hour
Right.
longer. And then it wipes out three slots, not one. And then all of a sudden the student can't get the course they need to graduate because it's impossible to make it fit
Exactly.
because people weren't
Exactly.
playing by the rules. Yeah.
You can have a campus that has a great climate where all students feel like they belong. You can have a campus where they have top-notch advising, caring, effective advisors, where the teaching is excellent and pedagogy suits students' learning styles. But if they can't get the course, there's no progress.
Yeah.
It's fundamental.
Yeah. And then all of a
And it's
sudden you got to enroll for another semester and you can't float the tuition,
right. And
then
what
you're
we're
stuck.
seeing
Yeah.
is that if students can't get a course, their second choice, the course that they choose instead is no course at all. Think about that. That means that they're now 3 credits short. They're not even taking any credits to make up for the course that they couldn't get. If you think of that at scale, that's a huge drag on our ability to get millions of students to their credential on time. And so we're working with 11 institutions to help them understand what the data is telling them about where the obstacles are, where the bottlenecks are. Institutions that are seeing that critical first year courses are just overloaded. So those first year students are not getting them. In first and second semester, if a student can't get a course, that is so discouraging, a course that
Yeah.
they need. It's so discouraging.
Yeah. Like if you don't get the prereq, then you're set back. Yeah.
And the complexities of the curriculum now make it
So
even more difficult.
you mentioned earlier the problem used to be people would say, I don't have the data. Now they don't know what to do with it. What are some of the other things that are changing this work? Certainly the availability, the profundity of data, and the expectation
of using it in real time is one. But as you look around the corner to what leaders can do to enable student success at scale, what are some of the other big changes you're seeing?
I s Another change that I see in this work recently is the importance of elevating student voice and listening to students. You did that with us when we were at SUNY Fredonia. When we were looking at how to redesign our student support services, and you canvassed students going into the cafeteria.
Yeah, intercept interviews. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. That is one example of that, but we're now seeing more and more institutions being really intentional about how they seek voices. And I don't want to say, I shouldn't say student voice, I should say student voices because it's not
Hmm.
one voice. But make sure that they are asking students, having and building in formal and informal ways for students to talk to them about what is working and what isn't working. They have surveys,
Yeah.
they have data. Not everyone's looking at it in a systematic way. And I would say that every cabinet should be reading every student survey that is done at that institution. What are your students telling you through your formal surveys?
Hmm.
Then what are the other ways that your students are talking to you? I think most campus leadership is intentional about making sure that they have relationships with student leaders, but also seeking out ways to have conversations with those who may not feel that they are part of the traditional structures for student governance.
What would your advice be? So gather the what, so what, now what, and
Mm.
listen to students and remove the artificial barriers. What would you say to peers that are deans, provosts, VPs of technology advancement facilities? What's your advice on student success at scale?
Number one is know your students and make sure that everyone knows who your students are, because many people on a campus can be working from an idea of who they are serving. I know that when I started as a faculty member, I was teaching the students I wished I had and not the students I had in front of me. There's a difference between the idea I've got of my students and who they really are and really knowing them. Leadership needs to know the data on the students, disaggregated data on the students. What is it telling you about who you're serving? And then share that widely and regularly with the campus. Then I would say make sure that your deans know who they are
Hmm.
serving, because it's different from college to college. And I did that as a provost. I used to say to them, Dean, do you know who your students are exactly? Do you know what the retention rate is in your first year classes? Do you know who's succeeding and who isn't? Do you know what the number one transfer school is for your institution? And then departments. Do the departments really know their students? What is the data telling them about who they're serving? Who's succeeding? Who's persisting? Who isn't? Where they're going instead? So
Right.
that's one part. And then I would say make sure you have multiple ways to listen to your students. I would also say, do you know what you're already doing? And one of the things we do with our institutions is we do landscape audits of the student success activities that are already going on. I think right now on some campuses, they may feel like there's a frantic level of activity by well-intentioned people going in multiple different directions.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice because sometimes there are well meaning parallel efforts. Sometimes there's lots of things going on students aren't aware of. I know we've probably all been in the heartbreaking student workshop when a student's, I wish there was a way to do this, and you actually can do it. They just didn't know. And doing that, what are we already doing and what's working before we add more stuff? How do we break that? How do we break the cycle of keep adding more stuff? I think in the desire to serve students, we add new programs and centers and institutes and offices. Then it can become confusing and redundant and
We also
wasteful.
can't afford it anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we can't sustain it. I think a lot of leaders are saying this is not sustainable. And so you have to be able to assess what you're doing to make sure that what you're already doing is having impact before you add. I think simplifying is the way. of the future, simplifying the curriculum, because I think a complex curriculum has really overwhelmed students with choices, and they freeze and they can't go
Yeah.
forward. Emphases and within tracks, within all of that complexity is not necessarily good for the student. I think that just being additive is just not sustainable. And I think that many institutions now, with the kinds of challenges that they're seeing as a result of the demographic realities, we're seeing it already that institutions are saying we can't take this on. And we know that we at AASCU, we try to be supportive wherever we can. And we also know that some of our institutions are saying we can't take that on right now. And I think that's a good choice for that
Yeah.
institution. Yeah,
Yeah. Part of my answer to this question about how you stop the kind of the cycle of everything is additive is you just do a much better job at strategic planning and a much better job at assessment. And I think there are too many strategic plans that are just plain vanilla, anodyne,
absolutely.
5 goals. The
Mhm.
fifth one is organizational excellence. And they're just
Right.
trying to create a big enough tent where they don't have to make any decisions because everything fits under it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
a good plan tells you what to say no to. And then if your assessment is really telling you, like you said, what are you already doing? What's working? I think those things combined can help us integrate as opposed to add or consolidate.
And I think that's a big if your assessment is telling you
Yeah.
what's working.
Yeah.
I think that's a great place to put emphasis is how do you know that all of this activity is working?
Yeah.
And you may not know exactly that it was that program that led to that outcome.
To your point of what are you already doing? I think what happens a lot is there's, let's say, a retention problem is identified, and then you throw 6 things at it and it goes up, but which worked? Maybe only
Mm.
one of the six.
I've been guilty of it,
Yeah. You try
definitely.
and do
And
what you
it's,
can and get quick results.
when I was leading at the beginning of a decline, enrollment decline, had to keep myself from panicking. And then making decisions under that kind of stress, you really have to keep your cool and
Yeah.
take the long view.
Terry, thank you so much for your stories and insights and the inspiring work you're doing at ASCU. Some great lessons here for everyone about enabling student success at scale.
Thanks for the opportunity. I always love talking to you, Elliot.
Thanks for listening to the Connected College podcast. Subscribe to my Connected College newsletter at elliottfelix.com for insights and excerpts from my upcoming book, tools you can download, and special offers. You can also find more information about talks I've given, articles I've written, and upcoming events there. And please support the podcast by rating and reviewing it wherever you're listening. Let's create connected colleges where students will succeed.